So let me give some introductory remarks to the 4 lectures before I begin the lecture of the topic of tonight. 50 years ago, as I was finishing my studies in theology at the University of Innsbruck, Austria, and starting my graduate studies in sociology at the New School for Social Research in New York, the theory of secularization was the dominant paradigm through which the social sciences, as well as all branches of Christian theology, were looking at religion in the modern world. In a sense, in the last 25 years, I had to unlearn, or at least rethink, much of what I had learned as a sociologist of religion in the previous 25 years. Those Cadbury Lectures aim to present my revisionist understanding of the role and place of religion in our global secular age. The theory of secularization had 2 dimensions or components. The first was a series of empirically verifiable propositions concerning the evident secularization of European societies that seem to go hand in hand with their modernization. European societies were becoming increasingly less religious and more secular. The dynamics of European secularization could be measured at least by 3 different indicators. First, by the long-term relative loss of power and prestige of religious institutions, such as churches, when compared with dominant secular institutions of modern societies, such as democratic politics, economic markets, science and technology, mass media, the entertainment industry, and consumer culture. Second, by the general decline in religious practices among the European population as measured by the falling frequency of church attendance and participation in religious rites of passage such as baptism, confirmation, church marriage, and church funerals. And third, by the perhaps less pronounced, but nonetheless equally noticeable decline in religious beliefs, in the general belief in God, as well as in the more specific beliefs in the concrete confessional doctrines of the various Christian churches. But a more problematic theoretical explanation was added to these empirically verifiable propositions. The added explanation attributed the secularization of European societies to general processes of modernization, or to a series of what David Martin has called dangerous interrelated nouns of processes, such as industrialization, urbanization, individuation, rationalization, etc. These are by nouns of processes. What could have been a plausible historical narrative of particular European socio-historical developments was transformed into a universal teleological grand narrative of what was supposed to happen to all human societies as they became more modern. The theory of secularization postulated that they would also become less religious and more secular. Alas, this teleological projection of increasing secularization and religious decline has not been confirmed by general historical developments around the globe in the last 50 years. The undeniable modernization which has taken place in many non-European societies, in the Americas, in Asia, in Africa, has been accompanied frequently by different forms of religious revival and by religious pluralization rather than by religious decline. It should be obvious, therefore, that modernization per se did not produce necessarily secularization. But how can we come to terms with these seemingly divergent historical dynamics and trends? Namely, that modernization in most of Europe was accompanied by drastic secularization, while in much of the rest of the world, modernization was accompanied by religious revitalization. We cannot possibly address this question in depth without examining more carefully the second dimension of the European theory of secularization. As indicated, the first dimension of the theory was connected with a series of empirical propositions and with a theological projection that the same thing that happened in Europe will happen in the rest of the world. The second dimension of the theory of secularization, by contrast, was derived from its embeddedness within a general genealogical theory of religion. This general theory of religion, which had its origins in the Enlightenment critique of religion, offered diverse explanations of the socio-anthropological genesis of religion in primitive societies, at the same time that assumed the universal character of religion in all human societies, while recognizing the multiplicity and diversity of its forms. So, the multiple and diverse religions were all supposed to be a species of a singular genus, religion in the singular. So there was religion in the singular as well as many religions which constituted its historical forms. Consequently, the narrative of secularization could be embedded within a much grander narrative of the history of religion from its origins in primitive societies through its diverse developments in great religious traditions, it all ending in modern secularity. The great French political theorist, Marcel Gauchet, has offered recently such a political history of religion as a grand narrative of disenchantment of the world. This is the title of his book, The Disenchantment of the World, A Political History of Religion, culminating in what he calls the exit from religion. From this perspective, the secular is what comes after religion. Phenomenologically, the secular emerges as the natural anthropological substratum that subsists once the added supernatural superstructure of religion somehow disappears or has been taken away. Again, global developments in the last 40 years have seriously put into question both dimensions of the European theory of secularization, its theological projection into the global future and its genealogical projection into the origins of human history. Let me make clear that secularization of most Western European societies remains an unquestioned fait accompli. The secularization of European society is not in question. What has been questioned by recent global religious developments is both the teleological projection of European secularization onto the rest of the world, and this explains why many analysts today, Grace David, here in these lectures, among them, depict secular European developments as a historically exceptional rather than as the presumed general norm for the rest of the world. If before one used the trope of American exceptionalism to explain the deviation of American religious developments from the European secular norm, today people make use of the similar trope of European exceptionalism to indicate the European deviation from the supposedly global norm of religious revival. But furthermore, in addition, new revisionist critical accounts of the modern category of religion have simultaneously put into question the way in which the genealogical account of European secularization was set within its grand narrative of the history of the religion as a history of disenchantment. Those revisionist accounts, which have emerged within religious studies as well as within the new anthropology of the secular, point out that both religion and the secular, as they are generally understood today, are actually modern categories. Both categories only emerged slowly in the course of the 16th and 17th centuries and only crystallized as a modern binary system of classification in the 18th and 19th centuries. Therefore, the category of religion and the reality which it signifies as the other of the secular, rather than being traditional or primitive categories, are rather modern, novel categories and modern phenomena. Both categories have contributed nonetheless to a new modern binary system of classification of reality, which was unknown before the modern period, but which has now become globalized. The discursive binary system has contributed, moreover, to the social construction of religion and the secular around the globe. It is to the analysis and elaboration of all these themes, which I have now presented, that I'm going to dedicate the next 4 lectures under the following headings. In the remaining of today's first lecture, I'm going to analyze the emergence of the modern binary religious secular system of classification of reality in contraposition to 2 older binary systems of classification, the sacred profane system characteristic of all pre-axial societies, and the transcendent immanent system that emerged with the axial age and that shaped the system of classification of medieval Christendom. The second lecture tomorrow will focus on the internal European road of secularization. It will try to explain European patterns of secularization not as the result of general process of modernization, but as the particular outcome of uniquely European historical process of confessionalization and deconfessionalization, and as the after effect of the social construction of the secular immanent frame that constitutes the modern social order. The third lecture on Thursday will focus on the parallel early modern external road of European colonial expansion and on the intercultural and interreligious encounters between Europeans and others which shape the dynamics of formation of the pluralist world system of religions, but also the secular identity of European modernity. The final lecture on Friday will try to analyze the intertwinement of both global, religious, and secular dynamics that are shaping our modern global secular age. It will look at the global secular dynamics that are carried by the globalization of the modern immanent frame, as well as the global religious dynamics that are carried by what I call global denominationalism, by global migrations, and by the reflexive self-constitution of global humanity. The hope is that at the end of the 4 lectures, we may gain a better understanding of how the seemingly contradictory global religious and secular dynamics may be interrelated, and how global humanity is becoming simultaneously more religious and more secular. So, to the first lecture today, the modern religious secular binary system of classification. It may take me 5 minutes more than what it was announced, probably 55 minutes, because I had this introductory presentation. My own discipline, the sociology of religion, was established just over a century ago on 2 radically different foundations. It has, as one of its foundations, Emile Durkheim's general theory of religion as the socially sacred. Its second radically different foundation derives from Max Weber's theory of world religions of individual salvation. Only by overlooking its disparate foundations could the sociology of religion pretend to deal with the same singular phenomenon of religion. Durkheim offers a theory of the elementary forms of religious life before the differentiation of religion and the social, based on the classification of all reality according to the dichotomous differentiation of sacred and profane, a system of classification which is basically applicable to so-called primitive societies, indeed to all pre-axial societies before the emergence of the idea of transcendence. Following Durkheim, one may conceptualize sacred and profane as a general dichotomous classificatory system of reality, characteristics of pre-axial sociocultural systems that encompasses within one single monistic ontological order various realms. They later will be differentiated into different cosmic, earthly, social, and moral orders. All reality, gods and spirits, nature and cosmic forces, humans and other animal species, as well as the kinship, social, political, and moral orders are integrated into one single order of things precisely according to the dichotomous classification, the dichotomous classificatory system of sacred and profane. The entire system, however, is an immanent this worldly one, if one is allowed to use anachronistically another binary classificatory system, otherworldly and this worldly, or supramundane, mundane, that will only emerge with the axial breakthrough, since the very idea of world, as Remy Braque has shown, is an axial one that did not exist before. In his study of religion, however, Durkheim showed little interest in the otherworldly religions of individual salvation that constituted the focus of Max Weber's monumental work in the comparative study of the world religions. But Durkheim had no problem in applying his theory of the socially sacred to what could be called the modern secular sacred, to his study of secular morality, of modern nationalism and citizenship, and to his theory of the cult of the individual as the emerging religion of secular modernity. This already points to the incongruity of trying to equate the pre-axial sacred profane and the modern religious secular binary systems of classification. They cannot be easily superimposed. Religious sacred for Durkheim is whatever is socially and publicly sacred. Private individual religious, by contrast, is demoted by Durkheim to the category of magic. For Durkheim, it is the publicly sacred that determines the religion of any society, and not the differentiated and privatized religions that determine what is socially sacred. Max Weber, by contrast, shows little interest in what he calls community cults, which will be the equivalent of Durkheim's sacred. Let me quote Max Weber at length from his Enlighten, translated into English as the essay, The Social Psychology of the World Religions. So I quote, "The primeval cult, and above all the cult of the political association, have left the individual interest out of consideration. The tribal and local god, the gods of the city and of the empire, have taken care of interests that have concerned the collectivity as a whole. Thus, in the community cult, the collectivity as such turned to its god." End of quote. So far, Weber's community cult appears to be very close to Durkheim's theory of the sacred as the symbolic self-representation of the social. But Weber continues, "The individual, in order to avoid or remove evils that concern himself, above all sickness, has not turned to the cult of the community, but as an individual, he has approached the sorcerer as the oldest personal and spiritual advisor. Under favorable conditions, this had led to the formation of a religious community as opposed to the community cult, which has been independent of ethnic associations. Some, though not all, mysteries have taken this course. They have promised the salvation of individuals, qua individuals, from sickness, poverty, and from all sorts of distress and danger. Thus the magician has transformed itself into the mystagogue, collective arrangements for individual suffering per se and for salvation from it have originated in this fashion. So far, the quote. At first, it would seem as if Weber would be drawing here a distinction similar to the one Durkheim made between religion and magic. In contradistinction to Durkheim, however, Weber seems to place the original dynamic of the process of religious rationalization in magic rather than in the social sacred. But more importantly, Weber is pointing here to another, perhaps irreducible duality of the phenomenon we call religion, this time grounded in two very different types of the social that could be called the societal social, or the political public social, and the associational private social, a distinction that is crucial for understanding the dynamics of social change in Weber's analytical framework. The two types of religion correspond to two different types of association with different membership entry rules. In the case of community cults, the socio-political and the ethno-religious community tend to be coextensive. Consequently, one is born into community cults, and membership in both the society and the religious community coincides. Following Robertson Smith and Fustel de Coulanges, Durkheim viewed correctly the God of the community cult as the symbolic representation and sacralization of the community. Following Weber, by contrast, religious communities and salvation religions in particular are constituted in and through the association and congregation of individuals in response to a specifically religious promise. Originally, at its inception, the religious community is differentiated from and not coextensive with the societal or the political community, although eventually it may also serve as the principle of integration of a new socio-political formation, as we were discussing before. Constantine brought Christianity back into the sacralization of the empire. Since they release the individual from particularistic, ascriptive, and territorial ties, salvation religions are potentially conducive to the formation of universalistic religious communities through processes of ever wider fraternization. The focus of Max Weber's sociological studies were the new religions of individual salvation and world rejection, which emerged in the middle of the first millennium BC as an intrinsic phenomenon of the so-called axial age. Without entering into any of the debates concerning the axial age, let me simply state, following Robert Bellah, that the new historic religions and worldviews that emerged as part of this phenomenon broke through the cosmological monism characteristic of all pre-axial religions and proclaimed a new, higher, and transcendent realm of universal reality. Despite the significant differences in their symbol systems, axial religions, let's call them religions, although they were not called so yet, and worldviews are dualistic and universalistic. They offer new paths of individual salvation or of ethical self-fashioning, which make possible for the first time a clearly structured conception of the self, differentiated from the community, and the conception of man, universal man, as such. What defines the axial revolutions is precisely the introduction of a new classificatory scheme that results from the emergence of transcendence, of an order, principle, or being beyond this worldly reality, which now can serve as a transcendent principle to evaluate, regulate, and possibly transform this worldly reality. as in the case of the Platonic world of ideas, or the Confucian reformulation of the Chinese Tao, transcendence is not necessarily religious, nor does all religion, in quotes, need to become transcendent. If we are allowed once again to use anachronistically another dichotomous classificatory category, religious secular, that will first emerge within medieval Christendom and will later expand into a central dynamic of secular modernity. In any case, following the axial breakthrough, the religious concern is relocated from the mundane, originally all religion is this worldly, which now becomes devalued, to a superior transcendent realm. Differentiated religious collectivities and new elites of religious virtuosi and literati, of word renouncers and prophetic denouncers, appear for the first time in human history. The single religio-political hierarchy of archaic society also tend to split into two partially autonomous hierarchies. This differentiation and the new universalistic transcending standards promoted by the new religious and intellectual elites bring a new level of tension and the possibility of normatively legitimated change. One may postulate that every axial breakthrough entails some kind of redrawing of the boundaries between sacred and profane, which may be interpreted as some kind of semantic relocation of the sacred, and may imply simultaneous process of desacralization of some aspects of reality, such as sacred kings or cultic sacrifice, and the potential resacralization of other aspects. In the case of ancient Israel, what Jan Assmann calls the Mosaic distinction entails first a radical, exclusive, monolatric sacralization of Yahweh as the God of the covenant, and eventually in the prophetic age, its elevation to the one and holy God, creator of heaven and earth, universal lawgiver, God of history, and Lord of all peoples. Such a sacralization of transcendence entails indeed a radical desacralization of all creatures and all cosmic and natural forces, and most of all, the demotion of all gods and supernatural beings into false idols and demonic forces. Surely the axial breakthrough of ancient Greece from the Homeric age to the classical age of Athenian democracy entails an equally radical redrawing of the boundaries between sacred and profane, breaking through the archaic ontological monism. But the dynamics of desacralization, the redrawing of the boundaries between various ontological realms, and the radical reformulation of myth in the light of theoretical criticism evince significantly different dynamics, dimensions, and directions, which I would not characterize as religious, even if the initial dynamics had sacred or divine dimensions. The very tripartite theological differentiation of archaic divine reality into mythique, or the mythical world of the gods, physique, or the cosmic order of nature, and politike, the conventional nomoi of the democratic polis, entails certainly a radical desacralization, but its dynamic is not necessarily a religious one, and its crystallization is hardly one of a single ontological dualism between transcendent cosmos and the valued mundane reality. So one observes, therefore, two radically different axial breakthroughs. Both entail process of desacralization that undermine the archaic, monist, sacred, profane order. But the dynamics are very different. The Israeli dynamic is religious through and through, in that by means of the Mosaic distinction, it invents a new axial type of religion. But the axial new religion will only find full crystallization in late antiquity with the transformation of Second Temple Judaism into Talmudic Judaism after the destruction of the temple and the end of sacrifice and the emergence of two daughter religions, Christianity and Islam. By contrast, the Greek process of desacralization can hardly be depicted as a process of religious rationalization. Of course, Greek philosophia had strong religious elements of theoretic divination that entailed the search of spiritual paths of self-realization, at times approximating transcendent religious paths beyond human flourishing. In this respect, it would also be anachronistic to speak of the Greek axial path as being more secular than the Israeli one, a modern category, secular, that has its origins in a radically different Christian theological system than the Greek one. It is important to stress that the modern categories of religion and secular first emerged as Christian theological categories in the process of intertwinement of the Israeli and Greek axial breakthroughs within Latin Christendom. As a Christian theological category, the Latin term seculum always had a dual temporal and spatial dimension, as is obvious by looking at the equivalent noun in any modern Romanic language dictionary. The word siglo in Spanish, or siècle in French, has three distinct connotations, two temporal ones, age and century, and a spatial one, world. The concept of century is a specific 100-year calendar unit dividing secular time, as opposed to the more indefinite periodization of age is of rather recent origin, 13th century or so. One can notice, however, that the two older connotations of seculum, age, and world still survive in modern Romanic languages. Originally, the pre-Christian Latin term seculum only had a temporal connotation, that of an indefinite period of times, as in per secula seculorum, a term equivalent to the Greek concept of aeon. It was Augustine who turned the term into a central Christian theological category, adding to it a spatial connotation. Seculum, as first used by Augustine, now refers to a temporal space. This world, between the present and the parousia, the second coming of Christ, in which both Christians and pagans had to live together and learn to work together towards their common civic goals in the seculum, in the city of man. In this respect, Augustine's concept of secularity is very close to the post-secularist principle advanced by some analysts today. It is in any case similar to the modern meaning of a secular political sphere, that of the constitutional democratic state and that of a democratic public sphere, which is neutral with respect to all worldviews, religious as well as non-religious. Such a conception does not equate the secular with the profane as the other of the sacred, nor is the secular the other of the religious. It is precisely a neutral space that can be shared by all who live in a not religiously homogeneous or in a multicultural society, which by definition will have different and most likely competing conceptions of what is sacred and what is profane. This was precisely the situation in late antiquity. Judeo-Christian monotheism had led to a desacralization or disenchantment of the pagan sacred. Consequently, the Christians' refusal to sacrifice to pagan gods or to worship the divine emperor earned them the epithet of atheist. The Christian sacred was the pagan profane, and vice versa. Augustine's concept of the secular was not yet tied to the modern binary opposite religious. This was going to be the work of transformation of the late post-imperial Christianity and of medieval Christendom. But the principle presupposed already an axial conception of religion. Augustine was, after all, also the author of De Vera Religione, a treatise which challenged Varro's customary tripartite Latin conceptualization of religion, or divine affairs, res divine, into theologia mythica, theologia naturalis, and theologia civilis. Varro's distinction was borrowed from the Stoics and was built upon the Greek axial differentiation of the pre-axial sacred into mythicae, physicae, politicae, which, as we indicated, broke the ontological cosmological monism of the pre-axial sacred. Augustine's concept of true religion presupposed equally what Ian Assman has defined as the axial mosaic distinction between axial true religion and pre-axial idolatry, in the same way as his immanent earthly or mundane city of man presuppose the axial transcendent city of God. It's important to realize that the post-axial seculum is not equivalent to the pre-axial profane, in the same way as the post-axial religious is not equivalent to the pre-axial sacred. The important point to stress is that as binary terms, religious and secular are specific Western Christian theological categories which have no equivalent not only in other non-Christian cultures, but even in Eastern Byzantine Christianity. You cannot find the two categories, religion and secular, in Greek. The binary spatial distinction between religious and secular emerged first with the elevation of the Christian monastic life as the paradigmatic form of religious life, and with the subsequent canonical differentiation within the church between the otherworldly religious or regular clergy who inhabited the monasteries in eschatological space that anticipated the transcendent city of God, and the secular clergy who, along with ordinary Christians, that is, the laity, inhabited this world that is the seculum. Indeed, the plural term religiones was often used within Latin Christendom to characterize not what we would call today multiple religions, but rather multiple Christian monastic orders. Eventually, however, with the consolidation of Western medieval Christendom and the hegemonic triumph of the Christian church, the secular became one of the terms of a dyad, religious secular, which served to structure the entire spatial and temporal reality of medieval Christendom into a binary system of classification separating two worlds: the religious, spiritual, sacred world of salvation and the secular, temporal, profane world. It is from this new theological perspective of medieval Christendom that the modern meaning of secularization emerges. To secularize means, first of all, to make worldly, to convert religious persons or things into secular ones, as when a religious person abandons the monastic rule to live in the world, or when monastic property is secularized. This is the medieval Christian theological meaning of the term secularization that may serve, however, as the basic metaphor of the historical process of Western European secularization. This historical process needs to be understood as a particular reaction to the structural dualism between the religious and the secular world. Even in Western Europe, however, this process of secularization follows two different dynamics which eventually crystallized into the Nordic Protestant and the Southern Catholic patterns. The North American pattern, as I will argue in my third lecture, presents a third non-European alternative dynamic. The first dynamic is one of internal Christian secularization, which aims to spiritualize the temporal and to bring the religious life of perfection out of the monasteries into the secular world. It tends to transcend the dualism by blurring the boundaries between the religious and the secular, by making the religious secular and the secular religious through mutual reciprocal infusion. This path was initiated by the various medieval movements of Christian reform of the seculum, gained further institutionalization in and through the Protestant Reformation in all its versions, and has attained its most radical and paradigmatic expression in the Anglo-Saxon sectarian Calvinist cultural area, particularly in the United States. The second very different, at times almost opposite dynamic of secularization takes the form of laicization. It aims to emancipate all secular spheres from clerical ecclesiastical control, and in this respect, it is marked by a laic clerical antagonism, which became exacerbated by the Counter-Reformation and by the absolutist alliance of throne and altar during the Ancien regime. Unlike the Protestant path, however, here in the Southern Catholic pattern of secularization, the boundaries between the religious and the secular are rigidly maintained, but those boundaries are pushed into the margins, aiming to contain, privatize, and marginalize everything religious, while excluding it from any visible presence in the secular public sphere, now defined as the realm of laicite, freed from religion. This is the paradigmatic French Latin Catholic path of secularization, but it will find diverse manifestations also throughout continental Europe. With many variations, these are the two main dynamics of European secularization, which culminate in our secular age. In different ways, both paths lead to an overcoming of the medieval Christian dualism of transcendent and immanent realms through a positive affirmation and revaluation of the seculum, that is, of the secular age and of the modern world, in viewing the immanent secular world with a quasi-transcendent meaning as the place for human flourishing. The two different patterns of secularization, Northern Protestant and Southern Catholic, are related to different dynamics of deconfessionalization, which in turn are related to the different proceeding dynamics of confessionalization of the absolutist state in Lutheran Protestant and in Catholic Europe. Bringing back the analytical distinction between the pre-axial sacred and axial religion, or the distinction between the two types of religion, the Durkheimian socially sacred and religious of individual salvation, may help to elucidate the main differences in the two patterns. In the same way as the axial breakthrough was characterized by a certain dissociation of the pre-axial sacred and the new salvation religions that led to a new relocation of the sacred, the modern process of secularization leads to a new dissociation of the collectively sacred and the individualized religious, and to a new relocation of the sacred in the secular public sphere on the one hand, and in the individualized and privatized religious sphere on the other. If following Durkheim one identifies religion with the socially sacred, then by definition, religion is the system of beliefs and practice in relation with the sacred, which serves to unify its adherents into a single moral community, the church. This church for Durkheim is, however, coextensive with society, which in the modern context would mean the nation, rather than with what customarily we would call ecclesiastical institutions or religious communities. Durkheim goes so far as to assert that individual religion either is simply derived from group religion or is not religion at all, but magic. From this perspective, the process of early modern state confessionalization, and the later process of deconfessionalization, which we will analyze in tomorrow's lecture, can be understood as processes of fusion, dissociation, and relocation of the socially sacred ecclesiastical institutions and individualized religion. Besides its spatial meaning as a realm distinct from the religious, there is another meaning of secular, which is linked to what I call philosophico-historical secularism. Secularism understands the secular not as one of two mutually constituted binary poles, religious and secular, or as an optional worldview, belief versus unbelief, but rather as a post-religious temporal stage. What Taylor calls the naturalization of unbelief or non-religion as the normal human condition in modern societies corresponds to the assumptions of the dominant theories of secularization, which have postulated a progressive decline of religious beliefs and practices with increasing modernization, so that the more modern a society, the more secular, i.e., the least religious it is supposed to become. As I will try to argue in tomorrow's lecture, secularization in the sense of being devoid of religion does not happen automatically as a result of process of modernization, but it needs to be mediated phenomenologically by some other particular historical experience. Self-sufficient secularity, that is the absence of religion, has a better chance of becoming the normal, taken for granted position if it is experienced not simply as an unreflexively naive condition, as just a fact, but actually as the meaningful result of a natural process of development. As Taylor has pointed out, modern unbelief is not simply a condition of absence of belief, nor merely indifference. It is a historical condition that requires the perfect tense, a condition of having overcome the irrationality of belief. Intrinsic to this phenomenological experience is a modern stadial consciousness inherited from the Enlightenment, which understands this anthropocentric change in the conditions of belief as a process of maturation and growth, as a coming of age and as progressive emancipation. For Taylor, this stadial phenomenological experience serves in turn to ground the phenomenological experience of exclusive humanism as the positive, self-sufficient, and self-limiting affirmation of human flourishing, and as the critical rejection of transcendence beyond human flourishing as self-denial and self-defeating. In this respect, the historical self-understanding of secularism has the function of confirming the superiority of our present modern secular outlook over other supposedly earlier and therefore more primitive religious forms of understanding. To be secular means to be modern, and therefore by implication to be religious means to be somehow not yet fully modern. This is the ratchet effect of a modern historical stadial consciousness, which turns the very idea of going back to a surpassed condition into an unthinkable intellectual regression. As a summary conclusion to today's lecture, one could argue that in primitive societies, before the emergence of any religious differentiation, religion was not there yet, or it was diffused throughout the social system. In modern secular societies, religion becomes once again diffuse once its values become institutionalized in social structures and individual authenticity and self-expression become its main private, invisible forms. In between these two beginning and ending stages of religious developments, one finds the world historical process of religious rationalization so poignantly analyzed by Weber. In this way, religion while a changing reality can be affirmed as a permanent social fact that is equally congruent with the pre-axial sacred, with axial transcendence, and with a modern secular order. The particular Western Christian dynamic of secularization, which we have analyzed in today's lecture, became globalized through the process of Western colonial expansion, so that the entire globe now uses the binary religious secular system of classification. But as we will see in the following lectures, the modern categories of religion and the secular have been incorporated, but while entering into dynamic tension with the many different ways in which other civilizations had drawn boundaries between sacred and profane, transcendent and immanent, religious and secular. I would like to reiterate that we should not, I'm missing my last page, my last sentence, that we should not think of these dyadic pairs of terms as being synonymous. The sacred tends to be immanent in pre-axial cultures. The transcendent is not necessarily religious in some axial civilizations. The secular is by no means profane in our secular age. Thank you.